Before there was reality TV, before there was the boy band industrial complex, before anyone had ever heard the phrase manufactured pop group used as an insult, there were four guys crammed into a Malibu beach house set, pretending to be a band on network television. Nobody involved expected it to work, and it worked so well that it nearly swallowed the four men who lived inside it. This is the story of the Monkees, not the sanitized greatest hits version, but the one full of rejected rock legends, a secret room under a soundstage, a family fortune built on nail polish bottles, and a reboot so disastrous it barely left a footprint. Stick with us, because by the end of this list you'll understand how a group invented for a sitcom ended up reshaping the music industry itself. Let's start at the very beginning, with a job posting. Most bands start in a garage. The Monkees started in a filing cabinet. In 1965, two young television producers, Bob Rafelson and Bert Schneider, were kicking around an idea for NBC, an American sitcom that captured the loose, anarchic spirit of the Beatles' film A Hard Day's Night, except with a group invented specifically for television. Their first move wasn't to build a band from nothing. It was to try to hire one that already existed. They set their sights on the folk rock outfit The Lovin' Spoonful, but songwriter John Sebastian had already locked the group into a record contract elsewhere, which meant the studio couldn't control or profit from the band's music. That single contractual snag changed the entire course of pop culture history. With the Spoonful off the table, Rafelson and Schneider pivoted to building a group from scratch, performer by performer. One piece was already sitting in their pocket. Davy Jones, a British actor who had signed a long-term deal with Screen Gems and who was hardly a nobody. He'd already played the Artful Dodger in the Broadway run of Oliver and picked up a Tony nomination for it back in 1963. Everyone else had to be found the old-fashioned way. In September of that year, the production placed a now-famous casting notice in trade papers like Daily Variety and The Hollywood Reporter, calling for four insane boys with some kind of folk or rock musical background who were willing to act. Hundreds of hopefuls lined up, reportedly more than 400 of them. Only 3 more slots were open, and the men who filled them arrived by wildly different paths. Michael Nesmith was the rare candidate who actually read the trade ad and walked in cold. Peter Tork heard about the audition secondhand, tipped off by a friend who'd already tried and failed to land a spot. And Mickey Dolenz, a former child actor who'd starred years earlier in the series Circus Boy under a different stage name, picked up word of the project while making the rounds of Hollywood auditions. 4 strangers for completely different roads into the same room. And from that room came one of the best-selling acts of the decade. Here's a piece of trivia that sounds made up, but absolutely isn't. The mother of a Monkee invented liquid paper. In the 1950s, Bette Nesmith Graham worked as a secretary in Texas, wrestling with the brand-new electric typewriters of the era, whose ribbons made it nearly impossible to cleanly correct a typo. So she improvised. Using a kitchen blender, she mixed up a batch of white tempera paint, poured it into old nail polish bottles, and started dabbing out her mistakes at the office. She called her homemade fix mistake out. The irony is that her side hustle eventually cost her the day job. She was let go after her own budding company's name accidentally slipped into a piece of bank correspondence. Instead of treating that as a disaster, she leaned all the way into the business, rebranded the product as liquid paper, and built it into an empire. By 1979, she sold the company to Gillette for a reported $47.5 million. Her son, a teenager at the time she was inventing the product, had actually helped bottle the stuff in the family garage. That kid grew up to wear a green wool hat on a hit TV show. When Bette passed away in 1980, Michael Nesmith inherited a substantial share of that fortune, and the timing could not have been more dramatic. By most accounts, he was in serious financial trouble at the time, dealing with the kind of money pressure that makes headlines when a former teen idol goes through it. The inheritance didn't just bail him out. It funded an entirely new chapter of his career. Nesmith became a genuine multi-hyphenate behind the scenes of Hollywood, backing music ventures, financing film projects, and serving as an executive producer on the cult classic Repo Man. A correction fluid fortune built in a Texas kitchen ended up bankrolling one of the strangest, most beloved cult films of the 1980s. You couldn't pitch that as fiction and expect anyone to believe you. Fast forward to 1973. The Monkees TV show had been off the air for 5 years, and Mickey Dolenz was in a rough patch professionally, trying to prove he could be taken seriously as an actor after being typecast as a goofy sitcom drummer. So when a new ABC pilot called Happy Days started casting for a leather-jacketed greaser named Arthur Fonzarelli, Dolenz went after it hard, and by his own account, he got remarkably close. The competition reportedly came down to him and a then-unknown Yale Drama School graduate named Henry Winkler. Dolenz has since said that Winkler spotted him sitting in the casting waiting room and immediately assumed the part was lost, figuring no casting director would pass on a recognizable face from a hit show in favor of a total unknown. The two later became genuine friends and have laughed about the near miss in interviews for years. According to Dolenz' own recollection, part of what worked against him was simple physical presence. He stood close to 6 feet tall, which would have towered over Ron Howard and much of the rest of the young cast, while the shorter Henry Winkler fit the visual proportions the producers wanted. What ultimately tipped the decision toward Winkler, by most accounts, was his recent work playing a leather-jacketed street tough in the low-budget film The Lords of Flatbush, a performance that convinced the show's creative team he had exactly the grounded, big-city authenticity the role demanded. Dolenz has been gracious about the loss ever since, freely admitting that Winkler's performance had a New York edge that simply couldn't have come from a Southern California kid. Dolenz went on to reinvent himself successfully as a director and producer. Winkler, of course, became one of the defining television stars of the 1970s. Sometimes a few inches of height and one indie film role are all it takes to send two careers down completely different paths. Before they were the Monkees, they nearly had a very different, much less iconic name. Producers Bob Rafelson and Bert Schneider spent time brainstorming names that would feel British Invasion adjacent, something punchy, a little cheeky, easy to slap on a lunchbox. One idea on the table was The Creeps, which the team reportedly toyed with before deciding it read as too negative for a wholesome NBC sitcom. Another contender was The Inevitables, which sounded more like a marketing slogan than an actual band. They even briefly considered the Turtles until someone in the room pointed out the obvious problem. There was already a real, working band with that exact name. Eventually, the group landed on a deliberately misspelled version of Monkees, swapping the Y for an E. The inspiration was hiding in plain sight. The Beatles had already done the exact same trick, twisting Beatles into Beatles to build a name that was catchy, a little irreverent, and instantly recognizable. Following that same playbook gave the show's marketing team a name that could anchor a logo, a lunchbox, and eventually an entire merchandising empire. Of all the names on the almost list, none carries more weight than Stephen Stills. In 1965, the 20-year-old folk musician auditioned for a spot in the group, and by every account, he crushed the musical portion. Strong songwriting instincts, sharp guitar playing, real credibility as a performer. But Rafelson and Schneider weren't just building a band. They were building a television show, and television in the mid-1960s had extremely narrow, superficial ideas about what a teen idol was supposed to look like. Stills was passed over for reasons that had nothing to do with talent. His teeth were noticeably crooked, and his hairline was already receding at 20. Here's the twist that makes the story worth telling. The producers liked him personally. By multiple accounts, they asked whether he knew any other musicians with a similar clean-cut vibe who might photograph a little better for the camera. Stills immediately thought of his friend and Greenwich Village roommate, Peter Tork, and pointed the casting team toward him. Tork auditioned and landed the role. There may have been more going on beneath the surface, too. Some accounts note that Screen Gems required cast members to sign away publishing rights to any original songs they contributed, a condition Stills reportedly wasn't eager to accept. Whatever the full explanation, the bad teeth version of the story is the one that stuck, probably because it captures so perfectly how thoroughly this project was built for the camera first and the music second. Consider what didn't happen because of that rejection. Without Stills sitting out the audition, there's a real argument that Buffalo Springfield, the band he went on to form with Neil Young, never comes together. Follow that thread further in Crosby, Stills, and Nash, and later Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young may never have existed either. Instead of becoming a sitcom regular, Stills became one of the defining guitarists and songwriters of his generation, eventually earning induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame twice in a single night, once as a member of Buffalo Springfield, and once with Crosby, Stills, and Nash. A rejection based almost entirely on cosmetics ended up nudging an entire era of rock music into existence. Stephen Stills wasn't the only future star sitting in that waiting room. Songwriter Paul Williams reportedly tried out for the show as well. The same Paul Williams who would go on to write hits like We've Only Just Begun, Rainy Days and Mondays, and the theme song to The Muppet Movie, among an enormous catalog of hits for other artists. He didn't get picked, and instead built one of the most successful songwriting careers of the era from the outside. Danny Hutton also auditioned and also missed out, only to go on and co-found Three Dog Night, a band that would dominate the charts in the early 1970s. Then there's the rumor that simply will not die, the persistent urban legend that Charles Manson auditioned for the show. It's one of those stories that gets repeated so often it starts to feel plausible, but the timeline makes it impossible. Manson was incarcerated during the exact window when the 1965 casting calls took place. Mickey Dolenz has joked about the rumor over the years, which, fairly or not, has probably helped keep the myth alive rather than kill it. It's a good reminder that even well-documented pop culture history accumulates urban legends that have to be actively debunked. By the show's second season, the studio had a discipline problem on its hands. For increasingly independent young stars, given any window of free time between scenes, would wander off the lot, crack jokes, disappear for stretches, and generally behave like the 20-somethings they were rather than the polished teen idols the network wanted on call. According to accounts from the band themselves, the studio solution was to build a windowless, soundproofed, air-conditioned holding room directly beneath the soundstage, a space that came to be known, only half-jokingly, as the Black Box. The stories describe a single door fitted with a heavy meat locker-style handle, and inside, a sparse setup of cushions and candles alongside a wall-mounted bank of 4 light bulbs, one assigned to each band member with his name printed underneath. When your bulb lit up, that meant you were needed on set immediately, no exceptions. The official justification was efficiency, keeping the cast close at hand so filming didn't grind to a halt looking for a wandering actor. The more honest read is that studio management simply didn't want 4 long-haired, increasingly rebellious young musicians roaming a working studio lot unsupervised. Whether or not it functioned as an actual holding cell, the symbolism is hard to miss. For performers playing a free-spirited, rule-breaking band on camera, while off-camera, they were literally pinned into a windowless room beneath the stage, waiting on a light bulb to summon them. But the story has an unexpectedly sweet twist. Inside that cramped room, the 4 of them actually bonded. They jammed together, traded ideas, and built the tight musical chemistry and vocal instincts that would later fuel their push to gain real creative control over their own material. A cost-cutting, control-minded studio decision accidentally became the closest thing the band had to a rehearsal space in those early days. However manufactured its origins, the commercial results were staggering. In a single calendar year of 1967, the Monkees landed 4 separate studio albums at #1 on the Billboard 200. Their self-titled debut, More of the Monkees, Headquarters, and Pisces, Aquarius, Capricorn, and Jones Limited. Since Billboard began publishing its weekly album chart in the 1950s, no other act has ever matched that feat of 4 chart-topping albums within one single year. Not even the Beatles, whose closest comparable year topped out at 3. The singles performed just as well. Last Train to Clarksville, I'm a Believer, and Daydream Believer all reached #1 on the Hot 100. I'm a Believer, written by Neil Diamond, held the top spot for 7 weeks and ranks among the best-selling singles of the entire decade. More of the Monkees was, if anything, even bigger. 18 consecutive weeks at #1 and reported sales north of 5 million copies, making it the best-selling album of 1967 in one of the most competitive years in music history. Then comes the twist that says everything about how the band was perceived at the time. Headquarters The one album on which the four of them actually played their own instruments and wrote the bulk of the material themselves, hit number 1 for exactly 1 week before being knocked down to number 2, where it sat for 11 straight weeks, parked behind the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. The one moment they proved they were a genuine band coincided precisely with one of the most acclaimed albums ever made sitting directly on top of them for the entire Summer of Love. For a long stretch, the band barely touched the instruments on their own records. Their first 2 albums were built almost entirely by professional songwriters paired with a wrecking crew, the elite pool of Los Angeles session musicians who were quietly playing on records for the Beach Boys, Frank Sinatra, and a huge share of what was on the radio in the mid-1960s. The Monkees themselves mostly showed up, recorded lead vocals, and went home. That was the arrangement, and commercially for a while, it worked exactly as designed. Music supervisor Don Kirshner ran the operation with the efficiency of an assembly line, leaning on songwriting and production teams like Boyce and Hart to churn out hit after hit. But the band grew to resent the setup, and the tension boiled over in January 1967 when Kirshner released more of the Monkees without so much as informing the group beforehand. They had no input on the track list, no approval over the cover photo, which had been lifted from an unrelated promotional shoot, and the liner notes read like a celebration of Kirshner's own role in the project with barely a mention of the band that actually made it a hit. The group reportedly didn't even receive advance copies. They had to go buy their own record off a store shelf like anyone else. That was the breaking point for Michael Nesmith. During a heated confrontation, Nesmith is widely reported to have put his fist through a wall and warned Kirshner that it could just as easily have been his face. Kirshner didn't back down, and shortly after, he released another single without clearing it with the band, the show's producers, or the record label's own executives. That was one step too far. Kirshner was fired, and creative control finally landed in the band's hands. What did they do with that freedom? They made Headquarters, the first record where the four of them actually played their own parts and wrote most of the songs, working closely with producer Chip Douglas. But the newfound unity didn't last long. By the time they recorded The Byrds, The Bees, and The Monkees in 1968, the group had already begun splintering creatively, with each member cutting largely solo tracks that were then stitched together and released under the band's collective name. They fought hard to win creative control, and then almost immediately used that freedom to pull in 4 different directions at once. A surprising amount of what audiences saw on screen wasn't built for the show at all. It was recycled. Both the Monkees and the classic Three Stooges shorts were produced under the umbrella of Screen Gems, a division of Columbia Pictures, which meant the sitcom had access to a huge, ready-made backlit of props, sets, and wardrobe that had already been used for decades of studio productions. When a television budget is stretched thin, you use what's already sitting in the warehouse. The show filmed on the same Columbia lot where the Three Stooges had cranked out roughly 190 short films between the 1930s and the late 1950s, and it shows mad scientist laboratories, chaotic living rooms, and banquet halls kept reappearing across episodes in slightly different configurations, redressed just enough to look new. The most charming detail lives in the wardrobe closet. In a handful of early episodes, Peter Tork wore a set of bright orange pajamas printed with a blue bunny across the chest. According to Monkees fan lore, those weren't custom-made for him at all. They were reportedly the exact same pajamas Curly Howard had worn in a Three Stooges short 2 decades earlier. If that story holds up, the sweetest, most easygoing,